So I'm Dai Hankey. I am a 44-year-old Welshman, still living in Wales, never really left, to be honest. I'm a pastor of a church in inner city Cardiff, in an area called Splot. I am the director of a coffee roasting company that employs survivors of human trafficking and modern slavery to help them get back into work. I also run a charity called Red Community, which is all about raising awareness about modern slavery. Or the coffee company called Manumit Coffee Roasters, by the way. And I write a few books, a few kids' books and stuff as well. But I guess my biggest joy, apart from following Jesus, is that I'm a husband to Michelle and a father of 4 children who are all downstairs playing Mario Kart at the moment. So hopefully they won't be knocking the door too much during this interview. But that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, that's great. And as a follower of Jesus, how long have you been a follower of Jesus? I mean, how did you get saved?
Went on one of those Christian camp things at the age of 15, and like the first time I'd ever been on one. And I'd grown up in a family where my parents were Christians, and I was dragged to church, quite literally, but didn't really care much for the gospel. It was a very hedonistic, selfish, angry young valley boy. But at this camp, elderly gentleman just day by day unpacked the gospel, and by about 2 or 3 days in, I was completely convicted of my sin, but also completely persuaded that Jesus loved me, that his death and his resurrection were real, that he'd done that for me, and that I should place my faith in him for forgiveness and for salvation. I remember very, very clearly on the Tuesday night at that camp, sitting on a little wall with my dorm officer, just crying my eyes out and committing my life to Christ. And that was 1992. So you can do the maths. Was that 28 years ago, something like that? Maybe, yeah.
So, quite a few, yeah.
Quite a few.
How have those years been since then? I mean, what would you say is the best thing about knowing Jesus?
Whew, that's a difficult one to answer in a short space of time. As far as the second part of the question, I mean, just knowing Jesus is the greatest thing. But by the grace of God, I'm not one of those Christians. I'm not saying that this is better or worse than other people's experiences, but there's some Christians who genuinely have deep doubts and struggle with, am I even saved, or is God even real? By the grace of God, those have never been doubts that I've had to struggle with. So I've always had, since that day, an assurance that I am his. And I've committed a lot of sins since then. I wasn't perfect. After I became a Christian, far from it. I had a lot of struggles, still do. But the one thing which has remained constant throughout is just this deep, deep assurance that I'm okay with God, and God loves me, and that I'm saved, I'm his, I'm safe in his fist. That might be to do with the fact that I had some good teaching, from a very early age about the sovereignty of God over my salvation. The fact that if God saves you, that he's not going to unsave you. I just kind of I really believe that. In answer to the question about what's the best thing about being a Christian, I mean, there are many, many things, but one of the things I just love personally is I just love the scriptures. I love the Bible. Nothing thrills me more than when I open the Bible and I read something and I just know God is saying something to me through it. I just know his voice in the scriptures. It's like one of the greatest gifts you could ever wish to have. Just that assurance that God is for you and that he's speaking to you. So yeah, I love following him. It's an adventure. I love his word. It means I never feel alone in this world. I do regularly read the scriptures and just know the smile of God through the words that I read, or also sometimes the chastisement of God. But even that's reassuring. When God tells you off, it means that he's taking notice of your life. So that's my answer to that.
So how did you get to the point of wanting to actually be devoted to preaching and teaching those scriptures and pastoring people? How did that route go from sort of sitting on that wall to actually where you are now in terms of pastoring?
That's a great question. I would say that for myself, I never really had a deep down desire to be a pastor. I fell in love with the scriptures almost overnight, almost straight away. So I've always I'm a mouthy person. I think the one thing I would say is a God-given gift is I'm proper chopsy. So I've always talked about what I'm passionate about. And so it just became my passion. So it became what I wanted to talk to other people about. But I think something which happened very, very early on as well, maybe within a year or so of becoming a Christian, is I became very aware there was a lot of people who weren't going to church. A lot of them were in rough communities. A lot of them were in communities that, the church wasn't doing a great deal to reach. And that started to really bother me because I didn't want to be a Christian that wasn't concerned for those who weren't being reached. I'm very I guess my theology informs me. I don't expect that everyone you tell the gospel to is going to become a Christian, is going to be soundly saved. I expect people to reject the gospel when I preach it because I see it in the scriptures. But people have got to at least have a chance to reject it, and they've got at least got to have a chance to sort of to be not only told of, but also to be shown the love of God. So I think I had a passion for sharing the scriptures, yes, but I've also, like, hand in hand with that, I had a desire to want to preach the gospel in places where the gospel wasn't being preached, or at least to go and put the love of Christ on display in places where it wasn't. And there are lots of those communities, and they're often in council estates or inner city communities. And so, I remember as a 17-year-old, I started doing prison ministry. Started going to prisons and doing work in prison. I remember just wanting to, when I became a student, I came to Cardiff. I was much more concerned about who wasn't in church and who was in church, and that kind of has never really gone away. There's a scripture in Romans 15 about it's always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ is not known. I'd say that's probably been a banner over my life since being a teenager, and I still kind of regularly go back and revisit that, and I say, Lord, am I still being faithful to that conviction?
That's great. That's great. And in terms of people who helped you along that journey, you obviously had that burden, you saw it in the scriptures as well, and you had that concern for people. But in terms of people who helped you along the way, I know you've talked in the past about apprenticeship type stuff, mentoring, that kind of Paul, Timothy kind of stuff you see in Acts. Is that something that you've come across now and you're trying to do, or is that something that you personally experienced as well in terms of people helping you along that way?
No, I think there were always people further down the line. But again, I do often think about this. I think back to my formative years as being a Christian, and there are three figures who I think featured very prominently in my early Christian walk. The first one being my mother, who I still retain is the single most important Christian influence in my life, even before I became a Christian. I was horrible at times. I was very, very angry, aggressive, selfish, self-indulgent, just aggressive. And my mother was just so gracious and patient, gentle, prayerful. And she modeled the gospel to me in ways that probably no man or woman has ever done since. She's with the Lord now. She died about 11 years ago. But in those formative years of my life, she was just so valuable. And it's what I often want to share this with with Christian women who especially mums who might feel that, like, they're at home with the kids and they can't do a great deal apart from just sort of, like, be home and care for the kids. Like, never ever underestimate the value and the beauty of being a Christian mum. Because for me, and a lot of brothers that I've got as well, they would say the same thing about their own mothers. But just for my own sake, who my mother was and how my mother was so shaping, and to this day has affected me. In a more kind of formal mentoring kind of thing, though, there was a youth leader that I had called Uncle Phil. I grew up in the days where if you had a youth leader, you had auntie and uncle, even if they weren't related to you. So I had Uncle Phil and his wife, Auntie Chris. And they were just my youth leaders, and they weren't sensational, cool, amazing youthy types. They were probably in their 40s, early 50s. He worked in a biscuit factory. I can't remember where Auntie Chris worked, but they were just like loving, knew the Bible, loved the Bible, just spoke normal language, didn't dress it up. The home was always open. I was really good friends with their daughter, so I'd regularly hang out with her and then go to their house and we talk things through. And Uncle Phil was a huge influence in my life as well, just from his consistency, just like week in, week out, playing table tennis, opening the door, spending time with us, investing in us. There's a whole load of us at that time, and I just saw the value of faithful, not impressive, year in, year out investment in young people and in the gospel. That was huge. And then there was my pastor, Phil Williams, who, again, he probably wouldn't know how much of an influence he had in my life. And he wasn't a spectacular preacher, and I didn't spend a lot of time with him outside of the Sunday context. But every single week, I heard the gospel preached faithfully. I think that a lot of the theology that to this day grounds me, I just picked up from sitting through his sermons, bored off my head before I was a Christian, doing my best to engage after I was a Christian. But I often think of Phil's ministry this way. Like, someone once said to me, how many of your mother's meals can you remember as a child growing up? Like, and it's like, to be honest with you, I can't remember many of those meal times. I just know that she fed me faithfully all the way through my childhood, because I'm still alive and I'm grateful for the nutrients that she put in my body, even though there weren't many standout meals. There was a couple. But I think I'll probably say that that's a sign of a good gospel minister. Like, they don't necessarily preach a standout, showstopper every Sunday. They just give you the minerals that you need every Sunday until you get 10, 20 years down the line, and you realize that brother's been feeding me faithfully all this time, and I'm healthier than I would have been. I'm thriving because of it. So I think that those three people really, in those formative years, and there were others like Pastor Peter, who was the pastor of Highfields when I first moved to Cardiff as a student. I said very early on I wanted to get into ministry with rough people in rough places, and he took me seriously rather than some churches did and would have taken sort of told me to go away and grow up. I wasn't the right kind of person, and I'm not really the right kind of person for gospel ministry as far as qualifications go. I've never been to Bible college. I've got no degree. My degree is in recreation and leisure. So that's the only qualification I've got, so I don't know why half the people who take me seriously do take me seriously, but he did, and he kind of gave me ministry opportunities when most other people wouldn't have, which I'm also really grateful.
Yeah, thanks, Dai. I mean, personally, I've really appreciated when I've heard your preaching, and I think I take that seriously, because you're giving us the word of God, you're feeding us faithfully, and I really appreciate that. I wonder whether just over the last weird year, maybe things that you've been learning. I'm sure you've learned loads of stuff. I know with the business, with the Manumet Coffee, that's obviously changed a lot. But maybe stuff that you've learned, particularly in terms of preaching, pastoring, prayer, through the last few months that you'd like to share with us?
Oh, mate, yeah. I mean, I've actually been thinking of this stuff through myself, because I want to put out a couple of tweets before the end of the year just to say these are a few things that I want to sort of, I'm going to take January off Twitter probably, so I just want to leave a few things up there, for people to sort of read if they ever follow my account. But I have been thinking through how has God led me and shaped me, and what lessons have I learned. Certainly towards the beginning of the pandemic, I was really struck by, there's certain chapters in the Bible and certain books in the Bible that we often don't look at during times of peace or times of calm or times of blessing, but all of a sudden when it hits the fan, you realize are actually unbelievable. So books like Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, the Book of Job, 1 Peter, James, they just, and certain other verses that Paul preached about suffering in Romans, and 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. There's just all these different things that suddenly stand out, and you realize, wow, there's a lot in the scriptures about suffering. Lamentations especially. I led the church through a Bible study series in Lamentations, and it just did me the world of good just digging into that book. And until the pandemic hit, I was just quite happy to quote the verses in the middle of chapter 3 that everyone quotes. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, his mercies never come to an end. That bit they knew every morning. But actually the whole book is gold dust if you're struggling and suffering. I would say that through a whole load of things, the pandemic, through some problems that we had in the business before the pandemic hit, and all the way through to where we are now. Also coupled with the fact that my co-pastor in the church was back in the States from December and only came back in late August, beginning of September. So I had to, in many ways, I had to handle a lot of things on the ground on my own. My mental health took an absolute pounding. I can't say that I was clinically depressed this year, because I never went to a clinician to speak to to speak to them and find out and be told that I was depressed. But yeah, my mental health and my emotional well-being haven't been good at different points through this year. I think by September, October, I was completely pummeled. And I just threw I had to depend on that theology I was referring to earlier, just the security that I'm still all right in God's grip, that he doesn't save me because of how amazing I am, and he doesn't keep hold of me because of how amazing I am. It's not my fruitfulness that that is the most important thing about me. It's his faithfulness is the most important thing about me. Those kind of truths have been really real. And I've tried my best to be more prayerful, and I think that there were certain points in the year where my prayer life definitely was deeper, more faithful. I think that as I get to the end of the year, I guess my prayer life has defaulted to where it was before, as in things don't seem as stressful now as they did at one point. And it's interesting, isn't it, mate? How difficult times and stressful times, they actually, that's often the times when all the crap in our lives gets purged, and all the kind of the dross gets burnt away, and just what's gold is refined. And I think that's what that's the effect it had. But the suffering which that process requires is horrible, and nobody would want to sign up for that. But I think I'm more aware than ever of two things: of my smallness and God's greatness, or my weakness and God's strength. Pitch it how you want. My utter dependency on Him, and His utter delight to bless and to sustain and to heap grace upon me in those moments. I definitely don't think I'm strutting out of 2020. I'm probably limping out of 2020 a little bit, but that's not always a bad thing.